My name is Chris Mann, and this is the second video on how to accurately summarize Sam Harris's views and point out some of their flaws using the rules of logical debate as expressed in my other video, Logical Debate 3, and I'll put a link in the description box. This is based on a podcast Sam Harris had with Maryam Namazie, and I'll put a link to that one in the box too. I assume all views are implied until officially and explicitly stated on the record as mentioned in Rule 5. To use actions with positive connotations is to imply they are morally good. To use actions with negative connotations is to imply they are morally bad or strategically bad. When a person does something, that implies it's not morally bad. To do something intentionally or unintentionally needs to be reworded using the next best scientifically provable action as demanded by Rule 3. So I'll either drop the word intentionally or I'll change it to try to do something, because that is provable if you can give a definition in terms of scientifically provable actions. Alright, so the first clip.
So I just want to inform our listeners about the proximate cause of this conversation, because I've followed your work, I guess really just in the form of seeing some videos of you encountering people trying to no-platform you. I mean, this happened recently, and we'll get into this because you've received more of this than most people. But the proximate cause of this conversation is that I noticed you recently calling my views about profiling bigoted.
Okay. So here, Harris implies that it's not morally bad to inform listeners about the proximate cause of this conversation. That's what he's doing, that's what he claims he's doing, so that implies it's not morally bad, in his opinion, to do so. Alright, so that one was easy.
We all know about the regressive left, and I say this as someone who's firmly, very, very firmly on the left, who very often, promote and legitimize and normalize the Islamist narrative of things. So they will basically see, any criticism of Islam or Islamism as bigotry against Muslims, because Islamists often feign to represent Muslims, and they see it as a defense of the Muslim minority.
Okay, here, Namazie implies that it's morally bad to act like a regressive leftist, which means to promote, legitimize, or normalize the Islamist narrative, or to criticize criticism of Islam or Islamism as bigotry against Muslims. So, Namazie starts out by defining terms in order to make a distinction later.
I think it's very clear to possibly your listeners that I would say that they are promoting an Islamist narrative. That doesn't mean they're jihadis. That doesn't mean they are going to decapitate anyone. That doesn't mean that they are, defenders of a Khalifa or Sharia law. But they are normalizing and promoting the Islamist narrative, which means that, they're sort of giving it some sort of legitimacy. That doesn't make them Islamists.
Okay, here, Namazie implies it's morally bad to act like a jihadi, decapitate someone, or defend caliphates or Sharia law. And she implies it's morally bad to act like an Islamist. Namazie implies the regressive leftists are doing something morally bad, promoting an Islamist narrative, and adds that doesn't mean they are, and gives a list of other actions, implying that all these actions are morally bad.
My argument is that when we, or sections of atheists, normalize or justify or encourage certain narratives, it does promote a far-right narrative, which is a narrative that places collective blame, that promotes bigotry against people. That doesn't mean that anyone who promotes the far-right narrative is necessarily a bigot or a racist. So I think it's similar to how anyone who promotes the Islamist narrative is not necessarily a fascist. But there is that narrative that concerns me as someone who is both a vehement opponent of Islam and Islamism, but also a strong defender of human beings irrespective of their identities and beliefs.
Okay, so here, Namazi implies it's morally bad to normalize, justify, or encourage a far-right or Islamist narrative. These actions need to be defined in terms of scientifically provable actions. If she accused someone of normalizing a narrative, would he be able to scientifically prove his innocence? I also want to know what counts as a far-right or Islamist narrative. Can I get a full list somewhere? This is important because if I want to avoid doing this morally bad action, in her opinion, I need to know what it is I need to avoid saying, I need to have a complete list of exactly what Islamists are saying on the other side of the world. All right. So she also implies it's morally bad to place collective blame, and it's morally bad to act like a bigot, racist, or fascist. Namazi once again uses "that doesn't mean" to add to the list of morally bad actions and make distinctions between them. Okay.
But I think we can have this discussion without allegations of bigotry being the summary of the position you disagree with. And I feel like I've noticed you and Ina, and maybe other people are doing this as well, but I feel like you and Ina pull the trigger on accusations of bigotry fairly early, and it strikes me as pretty counterproductive, because I really do not think Douglas is at all bigoted. And that's not to say that I'm going to get you to agree with his views about immigration, but they're not coming from a place of having some animosity against brown-skinned people or Middle Eastern people or people from other cultures. He's quite worried about theocracy and intolerance.
All right, so here, Harris implies it's strategically bad to accuse someone of bigotry because of their immigration policy, given the goal of preventing the spread of Islamism. Harris is suggesting that Namazi not call people bigots just because they disagree on immigration policy. I say that he's merely suggesting it because the worst thing he said was that it's counterproductive. This implies that he thinks what she's doing is strategically bad, given that they all have the same goal. Harris implied that it's morally bad to act like a bigot, which he defines as to act as if you have animosity towards brown-skinned people, Middle Eastern people, or people from other cultures.
And I think it is a grave mistake to think that Tommy Robinson's criticism of Islam and Islamism is something that's commendable because he says similar things to what you and I say. I disagree fundamentally. And I think this is an issue for me that is key, because I am not only anti-Islam, I am not only anti-Islamism, I am not only anti-jihadism and Sharia law and the Iranian regime. I am also pro-secularism. I am also against religion's role in the state, including Christianity's role.
All right. Here, Namazi implies it's morally bad to criticize Islamism without also encouraging secularism.
What I want to say that there are lots of accusations, but to hide behind those and then say that raising an issue of bigotry, then trivializing it when bigotry is a huge issue for many of us, doesn't really help either.
All right. Here, Namazi implies it's strategically bad to describe true accusations of bigotry as false accusations of bigotry, given the goal of preventing the spread of bigotry. Namazi seems to be trying to refute Harris's strategic view, but I think she failed because the goals differ.
When I tell the regressive left that they are promoting an Islamist narrative, it doesn't mean that they're Islamists or fascists.
You can say it's promoting it, but that doesn't mean that it actually is promoting it.
All right. Here, Namazi implies a scientific view. To promote an Islamist narrative is not necessarily the same as to act like an Islamist or fascist. Harris implies a scientific view that claiming that someone is promoting an Islamist narrative is not the same as scientifically proving it. They're speaking past each other, but the real issue here is it possible to scientifically prove that a person is promoting an Islamist narrative? This action has yet to be clearly defined, and they're not going to define it.
What I want to say is that we don't agree. We don't agree on certain things, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, you know.
No, but there is something, Miriam. But there is something wrong with characterizing this disagreement in terms that demonize, or to use your phrase, otherize the other person in such a way as to make conversation and reasonable alliances impossible.
All right. Here, Namazi implies it's not morally bad for a person to disagree with someone on certain things. Namazi seems to almost be saying that she gives up on people she disagrees with, which would break rule 1 of logical debate, because you must try to change your opponent's mind using logic, not give up or agree to disagree. Harris implies that it's strategically bad for person A to demonize or otherize person B for disagreeing, given the goal of making reasonable alliances. To demonize or otherize needs to be clearly defined in terms of scientifically provable actions. The goal here could be better stated as the goal of preventing the spread of bigotry and Islamism, or, even better, the goal of changing your opponent's minds using logic and getting them to agree with you, because that's the point of logical debate in the first place.
I'm just saying is that when you go after me as someone who is irredeemable for using the word profiling, or to say that to use this word is to make common cause with right-wing bigots, by definition, 1, is unhelpful, but 2, is just untrue, right? It's just, I mean, there's absolutely nothing, in my view, about profiling or about security in general or about immigration, and again, we'll get into the details, that is an expression of my bigotry against Muslims, against people from the Middle East, against other cultures. I mean, there's none of that. There's not a shred of that. And yet you're responding to it as though there were. And that's what I'm finding so unhelpful.
Well, you know, Sam, the thing is that it might be unhelpful to you.
All right. Here, Harris implies it's strategically bad to describe someone as acting like a bigot for using the word profiling, given the goal of preventing the spread of Islamism. Namazi implies it's not strategically bad to describe someone as acting like a bigot for using the word profiling, given the goal of preventing the spread of bigotry. When Namazi says it might be unhelpful to you, she implies that it is helpful to her because her goal and/or situation is different. Because the goals are different, these views don't really contradict each other.
You know, and so for me, I feel it is as important to fight against racism and bigotry as it is to fight against Islam and Islamism.
Well, of course it is. I mean, but you're acting like I disagree with you.
Well, I don't know if you're disagreeing with me.
All right. Here, Namazi implies it's morally bad to not criticize bigotry or racism as much as Islam or Islamism. Harris implies it's morally bad to not criticize bigotry or racism as much as Islam or Islamism. So he implies that he agrees. Harris claims to agree with Namazi, but her definition of to act like a bigot seems to differ from his, in that hers seems to include using the word profiling.
it's not me being, overly sensitive and throwing out the bigot card at any opportunity. It's a real concern about the English Defence League. If you look at Tommy Robinson, he didn't leave the English Defence League because he was concerned about the fascist elements in that group. He has continued to praise and defend the EDL until today. And if you look at his speeches at Pegida rallies, for example, he says that he realized that it was too soon. The EDL was too soon for Europe.
All right. Here, Namazi implies it's morally bad to accuse someone of acting like a bigot without scientific evidence. Namazi is saying that she isn't being overly sensitive and playing the bigot card, which implies that would be morally bad. The evidence, the scientific evidence that Tommy Robinson acts like a bigot is in his other speeches where he defended the EDL, according to her.
Well, no, that's not actually what I heard him say. I want to clarify
my
that.
Perspective on it, Sam. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, but just to say
that Tommy has such a wonderful defender from
listen,
on your part.
no, it's not that, Miriam. That's not fair. This is just a single example of a person who I'm actually not very familiar with, who I know.
Well, then maybe you should listen to me because I'm more familiar with him.
But you're not characterizing the view he expressed in this interview. Did you see his interview with Dave Rubin?
It doesn't matter. A lot of Islamists will come and tell you that Islam is a religion of peace. I'm sorry, you cannot judge political movements by, Bush telling you that he's gone to Iraq because he wants to liberate women. It's not enough. I'm sorry, you have to.
That's fully. I fully grant that point.
All right. Here, Harris implied a scientific view. Tommy Robinson did not defend the EDL in the interview with David Rubin. Harris failed to point out a contradiction here. It doesn't matter if Robinson didn't defend the EDL in the Rubin interview, if he did defend it in other speeches, as Namazi claims he did. Namazi claims, she said, "I'm sorry." When people claim to be sorry, they're usually implying that they did something morally bad. In this case, Namazi seems to be apologizing insincerely. In either case, I would ask, is it possible to scientifically prove that a person is sorry?
I don't want you to assume a disagreement where there isn't one. And when I interrupt you, it's because
you're not letting me speak, and you keep saying but. There is a disagreement there.
Miriam, I'm interrupting you when you are attacking me for a view or criticizing a view I don't have.
About Tommy Robinson.
Okay, but
Sam, I don't know why you take it personally when I criticize.
I'm not taking it personally. I just don't want us to be wasting our time or our listeners' time. That's it.
It's not a waste of time, because isn't this the whole reason why we're having this discussion? Because there are differences of opinion.
No, well, yeah, but we haven't actually gotten to those differences of opinion.
All right, here, Namazi claims, "I don't know why you take it personally when I criticize Tommy Robinson for bigotry." Harris claims, "I'm not taking it personally when you criticize Tommy Robinson for bigotry." Now, to take something personally is not scientifically provable, so debating over this is against Rule 3. Harris implies it's morally bad for a person to waste his or her listeners' time, which means to criticize views his or her opponent doesn't hold. The real issue is, well, I want to know, what is the upper limit on the frequency and duration of criticism or discouragement so that it would cross over into wasting someone's time and become morally bad? He needs to give a specific time, upper limit on that.
I mean, briefly on profiling. Now, again, profiling is this dirty word, and I don't think it should be, but it inherits all the baggage of other ugly words like pedophilia or bestiality or torture. And so the moment you seem to be giving a sympathetic construal of this word, you have a lot of work to do. But in my view, okay, all profiling is to use some statistically relevant information in one's self-defense. And to be against profiling across the board, to be against profiling of any kind, is to be against using any relevant information to solve one's security problem. So, for instance, being against all profiling in intelligence gathering out in the world is to say that we should spend equal time scrutinizing the Amish or the Anglicans as we should members of the Muslim community, or indeed of the Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda, because to focus on Muslims at all, or even any specific group of Muslims, is profiling.
All right. Here, Harris implies it's not morally bad for a person to profile, which means to use some statistically relevant information in one's self-defense. He also implies it's strategically bad for a person to not profile Muslims or any subgroup of Muslims, given the current situation and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists. There's an issue here about whether or not it's possible to scientifically prove a person is Muslim or belongs to a subgroup of Muslims. Can you scientifically prove it by looking at them or watching them? Or do they need to verbally self-identify as belonging to the group of Muslims or a subgroup of Muslims?
For me, I think it's not necessarily that they're Muslim that it's happening. It's not necessarily that they're refugees or migrants or university educated, but it is their political stance that determines that they are jihadis and terrorists. And it comes to behavior rather than the fact that they're brown or that they're Muslim or that they come from Iran or Iraq or what have you. Because as I said, not all Muslims think the same.
All right. Here, Namazi implies it's strategically bad for a person to profile based on religion, race, education, or home country, given the current situation and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists. She also implies it's strategically good for a person to profile based on political stance or behavior, given the current situation and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists.
I think there is that danger with profiling. Profiling is an ugly word because I think it is ugly, in the sense of the fact that it is seen to be, profiling of blacks, for example, in America. It does have that history to it. Profiling Muslims, it does raise those very same connotations. And I think there are some security experts that would agree with me as well that you need to profile behavior rather than one's race or religion and so on and so forth.
Yes, profiling is often assumed has some racial component, and there is such a thing as racial profiling. There's absolutely nothing about my argument with respect to profiling for jihadists that considers race a relevant variable. In fact, it would be a starkly misleading variable. So there's nothing racial about what I recommend.
All right. Here, Namazi implies it's strategically bad for a person to use the word profiling to describe behavioral profiling, given the history of the word and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists. Now, if you can compare this with her 11th view, that it's not strategically bad to describe someone as acting like a bigot for using the word profiling, given the goal of preventing the spread of bigotry. So, if you abbreviate behavioral profiling to profiling, Namazi may accuse you of acting like a bigot. Harris implies it's strategically bad for a person to profile based on race, given the current situation and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists. So Harris is implying only partial agreement with Namazi's 16th view.
But I'm slightly mystified by what you just said, because what percentage of jihadists do you think are Muslim?
Sam, I think that is the wrong question. I'm sorry.
Well, you might think it's wrong to look for jihadists. But
Yes, but listen to me. I mean, the thing is that, you know, what percentage of Muslims are jihadists? Obviously, a large percentage. You know, even if they used to be Hindu or Christian, they are now converts and they have become Muslim, and so therefore, a large percentage of jihadists are Muslims. Of course, there is a link with Islam. I'm not saying that there isn't, but what I'm saying is that you cannot just assume that because someone is Muslim, they are a jihadist.
Well, of course not.
And
Of course not.
profiling, exactly. So profiling Muslims does that.
It doesn't. It doesn't.
Okay. Here, Harris implies it's not strategically bad for a person to profile based on religion, which in this case means to ask what percentage of jihadists are Muslim, given the current situation and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists. Namazi implies that it is strategically bad for a person to profile based on religion, which means to ask that question, given that Muslims are a minority in the West, and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists without causing people to assume all Muslims are jihadists. So this is basically an extension of Namazi's 16th view. Namazi seems concerned that asking that question will lead to the spread of anti-Muslim bigotry. Her phrasing here uses to assume, which is not a scientifically provable action. This could be made better by changing the goal to make it similar to her previous wording in her 11th view. But her definition of to act like a bigot still isn't clear, and I would want her to define it better. So anyway, I revised her statement to, it's strategically bad for a person to profile based on religion, given that Muslims are a minority in the West and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists while preventing the spread of bigotry.
And as I've said before, profiling Muslims isn't going to help us fight terrorism. What we need to do is profile Islamists. And that, I think, is where the behavior of far-right jihadis and Islamists, that's where we can manage to make inroads into this rather than conflate Islam, Muslims, and Islamists.
All right, here, Namazi implies it's strategically good for a person to profile based on political stance, Islamism, and behavior, given the current situation and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists while preventing the spread of bigotry. This is an extension of her 17th view, which was it's strategically good for a person to profile based on political stance and behavior, given the current situation and given the goal of finding suicidal terrorists.
Because when you say we need to profile for Islamists, you could say we should profile for jihadists, right? The thing that I'm arguing for is that we need to admit that we know what we're looking for. If we admit we're looking for jihadists, and we admit that 100% of jihadists are Muslim, then the variable of being Muslim is more relevant in the search for jihadists than the variable of being Amish is. In fact, if we could be absolutely sure that a person is Amish, they suddenly become completely irrelevant with respect to the search for jihadists. Now, I will grant you that there are other problems in the world beyond jihadism. There are other forms of extremists. There are other forms of suicidal terrorists even, and we're worried about them too, though not in the kinds of numbers we are with respect to jihadism now.
Okay, here, Harris implies it's strategically good for a person to profile based on religion, given that 100% of jihadists are Muslim, and given the goal of finding Islamic suicidal terrorists. Harris once again missed the chance to be more specific about the search criteria. He seems to keep saying, instead of checking all people, let's narrow it down to Muslims as a first step, and then narrow it down to Islamists and finally jihadists. And Namazi seems to keep saying, instead of checking all Muslims, let's narrow it down to Islamists as a first step, then down to jihadists. Harris could have said to profile based on the scientifically provable actions, behaviors, specific to Islamists that separate them from moderate or secular Muslims. Harris also implies it's morally bad for a person to act like a non-Islamic extremist or non-Islamic suicidal terrorist. This is an important concession. Because Harris implied this action is morally bad, he must criticize or discourage it to some degree. His strategic views in this debate so far seem to show a focus on the goal of preventing Islamic suicidal terrorism. So Namazi could ask him why he doesn't change his goal to preventing both Islamic and non-Islamic suicidal terrorism in proportion to the statistics of their occurrence. Or she could ask him to provide a schedule of how often his goal will switch between preventing each type of suicidal terrorism. In other words, this is failing to turn into a debate about criticism, discouragement schedules.
But we have to admit that we have a finite amount of attention. We have a finite amount of resources, and we should never deliberately waste our time. Now, there is a role for random searches here, which increases everyone's safety, and so randomness should be included. But what everyone has found galling, or many people have found galling, are obvious wastes of time, knowing that our resources are limited. So again, to take it out of the airport, as I tried to do a moment ago, if you're going to profile based entirely on behavior, which is behavioral profiling is certainly part of it, and I would agree with you, most of what you need to do is to profile on the basis of behavior, but adhering to a religion or to a neo-Nazi organization or whatever your identity is a type of behavior, right? So if you're looking for jihadists and you want to reach out to the community of people who might be aware of the jihadists in their midst, you're going to be reaching out to the Muslims. You're not going to be reaching out to the Mormons. And
okay, can I explain this again too, Sam, if you don't mind? There's a difference between a religious believer versus a neo-Nazi, and I think that's where, that's my issue here, is that
of course.
When you said, you just said something about where you're going to, a person who's religious or a neo-Nazi is very different. The fact of the matter is that for me, a neo-Nazi is like the Islamist. So
yes, I agree.
All right, here, Harris implies it's morally bad for a person to waste time, which means to check non-Muslims when searching for Islamic suicidal terrorists. Now, I took out the deliberately part. Harris also implies it's strategically good for a person to profile based partially on behavior, given that 100% of jihadists are Muslim and given the goal of finding Islamic suicidal terrorists. And he implies a scientific view. Adhering to a religion or a neo-Nazi organization is a type of behavior. Now, is it possible to scientifically prove a person adheres to a religion or a neo-Nazi organization? That depends on the exact definition of to adhere. It would be better to limit the search to people who act like Islamists, neo-Nazis, or other extremists, but he once again failed to be specific about what scientifically provable actions separate Islamists from moderate or secular Muslims. Namazi's reaction here was because Harris seemed to be comparing neo-Nazis with Muslims instead of with Islamists.
On the one hand, you are advocating behavioral profiling, right? But then when I go to talk about what that entails, you push back reflexively against the so-called collective punishment of behavioral profiling. What do you mean by behavioral profiling?
Let me explain, because when you say behavioral, I think you mean, because they're Muslims, that's a behavior, that's a, and therefore they're fair game to be profiled. And what I'm saying is that no, because religion is a lived experience, people live it in a million different ways. If we want to actually not waste the security's time, it would be best that they target this far-right movement and separate it from people who also happen to be Muslim.
Okay, so again, specifics here. So I work for the FBI, and I have 8 hours today that I can use to make the problem of jihadism and Islamism more generally go away. So I have a checklist of things I could do. I could interview the Amish. I could interview the imam at the local mosque,
You should interview the ambassador of the Saudi embassy.
Okay,
there.
well, that's I should also do that. I agree. And I could interview the imam at a mosque that is well known to be a Salafi mosque, right?
Well, obviously, then you're targeting Islamists. You're not targeting Muslims. That's the difference.
Okay, but of course, everyone in that mosque will say that I'm targeting Muslims.
All right. Here, Namazi implies a scientific view, or a definition. To use behavioral profiling to find Islamic extremists is to focus on the actions that separate Islamists from the people that also happen to be Muslim. It is to target, for example, people who visit Salafi mosques or represent the government of Saudi Arabia. Notice that Namazi seems to be okay with checking Salafi mosques, but not necessarily mosques in general. She agrees with Harris the moment he gets more specific than Muslim or mosque. My guess is she would also be okay with asking around for where Islamists gather, but you would need to be at least that specific. Harris implies a scientific view or theory. If I check a Salafi mosque when searching for Islamists, everyone there will say I'm targeting Muslims. Harris is saying that Islamists may accuse him of acting like a bigot, but the point could be made that they would not be able to scientifically prove that if Harris really was specific in his search.
Okay, but I show up at the mosque. I'm a member of the FBI. I show up and I talk to the imam, and I want to know if he's noticed any radicalism in his community. And he says, listen, I feel profiled here because you've come to a mosque simply because we're a mosque, and this is totally illegitimate. This is collective blame.
You have to show why you're there, right? You're not there because you're profiling Muslims.
Of course, I'm profiling Salafi Muslims in this case.
You're there because Salafi Muslims is like saying, the far-right fascist Christians. Well, you can't make the Christians and the fascist far-right and neo-Nazis are two different things in the same way that Muslims and Islamists are two different things. So I think targeting Islamists, profiling, if you'd like to use that word, profiling Islamists and jihadis is very different from profiling Muslims, and that's where my point of contention is.
Okay, well,
when you profile Muslims or Christians or whatever, Iranians or anything of that nature, you are placing collective blame. When you profile political movements and those who are affiliated with jihadis, with Islamism, with the Christian far right, what have you, that's a very different thing.
All right. This is further evidence that Namazi wants Harris to be more specific with his language. She uses to collectively blame or punish with a negative connotation when applied to Muslims, but not when applied to Salafi Muslims. This is the kind of specificity bigots wouldn't use in her view. Even if the imam accused Harris of bigotry, he wouldn't be able to scientifically prove it because Harris spoke using the appropriate level of specificity. So Namazi also clarified her definition a bit here. So I used what she said here and in her 16th view to revise her 5th and 6th views. So to place collective blame is defined as to profile based on religion, race, education, or home country instead of on political stance or behavior. And the same applies to the definition of to act like a bigot.
Mariam, if you think it's legitimate to profile Salafi Muslims, then someone who's dressed like a Salafi in the airport, who's declaring his or her allegiance, if you're wearing the niqab in the airport, you're declaring your ideology with your dress, right?
I agree that the niqab is a flag of the Islamist movement, but not necessarily everyone wearing a niqab is an Islamist. Some come from countries where it is enforced.
Of course, they're being forced to wear it,
and so on and so forth.
All right. Here, Harris implies a scientific view. To dress as a Salafi Muslim is to declare one's ideology with one's dress. Namazi disagrees, implying, to dress as a Salafi Muslim is not necessarily to declare one's ideology with one's dress. Now, as far as I can tell, based on Wikipedia, there's no clothing particular to Salafi Muslims. Namazi says that not all niqab wearers are Islamists. I think she's implying you would have to ask their opinions on political issues to determine if they really are Islamists.
And so going through security with Majid, we're talking about this, and I say, okay, look at that family over there. Would you be willing to get on the plane knowing that they did not pass through security? Would you be willing to bet your life and the life of everyone else on the plane that this is not a jihadist family preparing in the next hour to blow themselves up and blow their children up? Can you get the whole gestalt here based on how they look, what they're doing? And he and I reached total agreement in real time.
You did, but if I was there on the plane with you, I wouldn't have agreed.
All right, here, Harris implies it's strategically good for a person to openly support a policy that uses behavioral profiling on people in line and allows those determined to be low risk to bypass security, given the current situation in airports and given the goal of preventing jihadists from blowing up planes, while minimizing the amount of time and money spent. Alright, Harris seems to be claiming to be able to determine who has a low chance of being a jihadi by looking at their behavior in line. While it is possible to scientifically prove that person A has declared person B to be a low-risk threat after looking at person B's behavior in line, it's not possible to determine someone's political stance by looking at their behavior in line. You would have to ask questions. Namazi didn't say why she wouldn't have agreed with Harris, but that's probably why.
So if you look at those huge numbers, I think, oh my goodness, what's the least we can do, to sort of help people who are fleeing those awful conditions? And I think none of us disagree with the fact that it is awful. Mm-hmm. It would be to open borders.
All right. Here, Namazi implies it's morally good for a person to openly support an open borders policy, which includes background checks and interviews and allows refugees in. This would be better stated as, it's morally good for a person to vote for an open borders policy. But she can't say this because she isn't able to vote for this policy directly. If the ordinary citizens of a country aren't allowed to vote directly for the country's laws, changing their minds will not necessarily result in changing the laws immediately.
Open borders, look, separate from that fact, it is about a basic human right. When I talk about the right for everyone to have an education, for an end to faith schools, for the right to food for everybody, irrespective of, where they live and how much money they have, these are huge maximalist human demands that are oftentimes unattainable, impossible. Possibly they might even seem to be like dreams, but we need to always talk about the big ideas, the big dreams, in order to be able to have a little impact in people's lives. When I talk about open borders, it is about the fact that, look, there are people who are fleeing for their lives. They are fleeing for their lives. Men, women, children who have gone through the most atrocious things, and who are literally dying to reach safety. They are literally dying in our seas, in mountains, at borders. So I'm calling for compassion as someone who considers myself a human rights campaigner.
All right, here, Namazi implies it's morally good for a person to openly support policies that provide universal education, ban state-funded faith-based education, and provide food for everybody. Again, it would be better if people could vote for such policies directly. When people talk about rights, I translate them into actions individuals can perform as demanded by Rule 5. When talking about some kinds of rights, an important question often comes up, which is, why not say it's morally good for a person to educate children, or it's morally good for a person to feed poor people? Now, as long as Namazi actually does these actions, stating her views like this would lead to a faster virtuous cycle.
I think it is impossible to distinguish between those who come for economic reasons and political reasons, because if you look at the numbers coming, they are coming from areas where there is either war or also theocracies and movements like Islamist movements, where there's a lot of restrictions on people's rights and lives, and therefore, this dream of living somewhere safer, better, where you are freer is a dream we all have.
Alright, here, Namazi implies a scientific view. It's not possible to distinguish between people fleeing for stated political reasons and people fleeing for stated economic reasons. I added the word stated because reasons are not scientifically provable unless stated. Although she implied that it's impossible to distinguish between stated reasons, I think she meant to make a moral statement because she used the example of people fleeing Islamism for economic freedom. So I'll restate her view as, it's not morally good to distinguish between people fleeing for stated political reasons and people fleeing for stated economic reasons. Now, because of this, her statement about open borders can also be restated, and her 23rd view becomes, it's morally good for a person to openly support an open borders policy, which includes background checks and interviews, and allows political and economic refugees in.
Again, I'm not even clear what your view is here, so I just want to nail that down. So you don't want to distinguish between asylum seekers and people who are migrating for other reasons, economic or otherwise, because all of this is knit together, and everyone is seeking a better life, and they have a right to seek a better life in a global world where we're all just human beings. I understand that, but are you saying that there is no limitation on the number of people that the Europe or America or the West in general should accept into its borders? We should vet people for war crimes, but otherwise everyone should be able to immigrate anywhere they want to.
Well, yes, Sam, I do think that.
All right, so Harris picked up on the fact that she was making a moral argument for not distinguishing between stated reasons. Then he asked if she wants there to be no limits on the number of immigrants entering each country. By saying yes, she confirmed his guess. This clarifies her view a little bit more. So it becomes, it's morally good for a person to openly support an open borders policy, which includes background checks and interviews, and allows all non-criminal migrants in without any limits on their numbers.
At the beginning of this conversation, you said something about any talk of defending one's culture and worry that your culture could be destroyed by immigration, mass immigration, open borders, which is in fact the worry of someone like Douglas Murray, that is tantamount to bigotry or energizes bigotry. And I think that is a needlessly polarizing and, in fact, inaccurate thing to say. And it's not that there aren't bigots who speak in those terms, but It seems to me to be totally reasonable to worry what would happen if you just opened the borders.
All right. So here, this would be Namazi's 26th view, according to Sam Harris. It's morally bad for a person to openly oppose an open borders policy, which includes background checks and interviews and allows all non-criminal migrants in without any limits on their numbers, for stated cultural reasons. And so that was, according to Harris, that's his guess of what her view is. And then he goes on to imply that it's not morally bad for a person to openly oppose an open borders policy, blah, 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 for stated cultural reasons.
If you just open the borders, if we put you in charge here and we just let everyone go wherever they wanted to go, societies would reach some kind of equilibrium with respect to all of the variables that determine the quality of life in that society, which is to say that people would only stop coming to Europe or America once there was no longer a good reason to come, right? I mean, once Europe, for instance, was no better a place to live than the Middle East or North Africa. That, I think, would be the practical consequence of a true open borders policy. And that is something that terrifies someone like Douglas Murray, and for understandable reasons.
All right, here, Harris implies a scientific view or theory. If the borders are opened, people would stop coming to the West only when the West is no economically better than the Middle East. Harris seems to be making a case against open borders for economic reasons. This is a little different from opposing it for cultural reasons. So his 25th view would become, it's not morally bad for a person to openly oppose an open borders policy for stated economic reasons. He also implies it's not strategically good for a person to openly support an open borders policy, given the current situation and given the goal of helping the economic situation of poor people without hurting the economy of the West.
We know that if we just open the borders and let millions upon millions of people come into Europe from countries like Syria and Iraq and Iran and Muslim majority countries, you will be importing vast numbers of people who don't share Western values. You'll be importing vast numbers of Islamists, first of all, and other conservative Muslims. And given the problems of assimilation thus far in Europe, it's hard to see how that simply makes Europe better and not a lot worse.
All right, here, Harris implies it's strategically bad for a person to openly support an open borders policy, given the current situation and given the goal of helping the economic situation of poor people without allowing in Islamists. He also implies it's not morally bad for a person to openly oppose an open borders policy for stated political reasons. Harris is switching between talking about cultural reasons, economic reasons, and political reasons for opposing an open borders policy. He seems to speak of Islamism as if it's a culture, and thereby conflate concerns about culture with concerns about political Islam, which is Islamism, even though there are cultural differences between secular Muslims and secular Westerners. He speaks as if he doesn't realize that those interviews that Namazi includes in her definition of an open borders policy could be used to keep out Islamists.
There are free thinkers and women's rights campaigners in the smallest villages of Iran and Afghanistan, and there are bigots and theocrats in the biggest cities of America and Britain. And my point is that when you say you're defending your culture against this alien, savage, barbarian culture, there is some bigotry there because it fails to see the humanity of people. It places collective blame and equates them with the theocracies and the oppressive forces that they're fleeing.
Here, Namazi implies it's morally bad for a person to openly oppose an open borders policy for stated cultural reasons. Namazi objects to the use of the word culture when opposing an open borders policy, thereby confirming Harris's previous representation of her view. You can go back and check. To openly oppose an open borders policy for cultural reasons meets her definition of to place collective blame and to act like a bigot, because the word culture is not specific enough. Based on this, her previous views can be restated. So her fifth view, it includes this part here about opposing an open borders policy for cultural reasons. So that fits into the definition of collective blame. And I also added it to her definition of to act like a bigot.
If you bring in 1 million people into Germany from the Middle East, some percentage of them will be Islamists, some percentage will be conservative Muslims. Let's just talk about conservative Muslims who are not inclined to assimilate. Now, my question to you is, does it matter at all what percentage that is? Is there a difference between living in a society where 5% of the population is conservative Muslims and 50% or 75%? Is that a difference that someone like Douglas is justified in caring about?
Look, I mean, Sam, I don't think Douglas Murray is justified, and he thinks I am not justified. We're having a discussion about our opinions, right? The fact of the matter for me is that even if someone is a conservative Muslim, it does not make them a jihadi or an Islamist. You can have people who are anti-abortion, who don't go and bomb abortion clinics. You can have people who...
Please just change conservative Muslim to Islamist.
All right. Harris describes conservative Muslims as those who are not inclined to assimilate, but I think his definition of conservative Muslims includes Islamists and jihadists. Namazi's definition of conservative Muslims doesn't include Islamists or jihadists, so she must misunderstood him. They misunderstood each other again.
But so my question to you is, if you found that someone was an Islamist in the process of vetting them as a migrant, would you want them in or out as an Islamist? They haven't hurt anybody. They're not a war criminal, but they're clearly an Islamist. What do you do at the border?
If you want to fight a political movement, you have to fight it politically. You cannot fight a political movement by banning it, by deporting people who subscribe to that movement. You have to challenge it. It's the same with the far right in, let's say, in America, the Tea Party, Trump. You can't stop him by silencing him. You can't stop him by deporting him to Britain or another country that likes him. You can't send him to ISIS and hope that they'll get along. You've got to challenge his ideas. You've got to fight him.
All right, here, Namazi implies it's not morally good for a person to openly oppose an open borders policy that allows non-criminal Islamists to enter. This marks a turning point in the debate because, for the first time, Namazi seems to be contradicting herself. She seems to want to allow non-criminal Islamists to follow the secular Muslims who are fleeing Islamists. She doesn't seem to realize that the interviews could be used to turn... She doesn't seem to realize that the interviews could be turned into logical debates in which only those non-criminal Islamists who change their minds and renounce Islamism on the record would gain entry, which is my idea.
Then you are not dealing with the real issue, which is Islamism, which is the far right. And it's not just the Islamist far right, it is the religious far right in general, which I think the EDL, Pegida, Tommy Robinson also belong to. So for me...
But again, they're not killing homosexuals.
Is an important challenge.
But if you want to keep the distinctions that you find so important in a Muslim context stable, you have to admit that the EDL, as far right as they are not killing homosexuals or committing honor violence against women, right? It's a huge difference.
Sam, that is a very, very low bar, and I'm sorry, my bar is a lot higher.
Well,
there are Islamists who do not decapitate people.
That is
either.
the bar you use to distinguish conservative Muslims from Islamists.
There are Islamists who are considered soft Islamists. They are considered moderates. I'm sorry, I don't need to line up the heads of decapitated heads to decide whether a movement is bad for humanity or it's good for it.
All right, here, Namazi compares the Islamist far right with the religious far right in general to make sure people criticize all religious far right movements. This seems similar to her seventh view, which was it's morally bad to criticize Islamism without also encouraging secularism. Harris seems to think that she wants people to criticize all religious far right movements equally, whereas he seems to support a criticism discouragement schedule that's in proportion to the statistics of violence. So he points out that violence is not equally spread among all religious far-right movements. This leads to further misunderstandings instead of to a debate about criticism and discouragement schedules.
If they are Islamists that want to impose Sharia law, if they want to blow up innocent people or even people who are not innocent, prosecute them to
Great
not,
statement.
Do not target
Just
Muslims
stay there.
or
Just stay there.
minorities.
Wait, Miriam. You can't prosecute people for Islamism. You just said this. You can't deport Donald Trump, right? You have to fight ideas with
Prosecute them.
ideas.
I didn't say deport, prosecute. If they've committed a crime, prosecute them.
Okay, but you
If
can't
they haven't
prosecute
committed a crime,
Islamists. You can't-
challenge them.
What do you do at the
them.
border with an
You
Islamist?
challenge ideas. You challenge far-right
Should
movements.
Islamists be free to immigrate wherever they want to in Europe?
Look, the thing is that when you agree on fundamental human rights, rights are for people you hate.
All right, here, Namazi implies it's morally good for a person to openly support an open borders policy that allows non-criminal Islamists to enter. She also implies it's strategically good for a person to openly support an open borders policy that allows non-criminal Islamists to enter and then debate against their views, given the goal of preventing the spread of Islamism while helping secular Muslims flee Islamism. So here, the debate returns to where Namazi seemed to be contradicting herself. In an effort to help secular Muslims, she sees no choice but to let non-criminal Islamists immigrate with them in the hopes that Westerners can then debate the non-criminal Islamists into renouncing Islamism.
I think we cannot determine who has rights based on whether we like them or whether we agree on them. People have rights even if we don't like them, even if we disagree with them, even if we find their views vehement. And that's the difference. If no crime has been committed, you're going to have, in the same way that in Britain, we have people who are conservative, who think that, who are Christian, who think that gay people are deviants, who are opposed to gay marriage, who are opposed to abortion and,
Yes.
Women's right to choose.
Yes.
I can't say that, you can't access healthcare because I don't like the fact that you're a Christian, fundamentalist. Because that's a right, the right to healthcare,
Okay.
the right to food, the right to education, the right to shelter, and the right to asylum. The fact that the right to asylum is not recognized as a basic human right by many people doesn't mean that it isn't one.
All right, so Namazi is once again talking in terms of rights, so I translate as follows. It's morally good for a person to openly support policies that provide universal health care, food, education, shelter, and asylum. This is similar to her 24th view. Again, the question can be asked, wouldn't it be better to state this as, it's morally good for a person to provide someone with health care, food, education, shelter, and asylum directly?